as we are changing over, I'm going to introduce Dan Benya, who's with the PepsiCo Corporation, and he has been responsible for most of their sustainability initiatives. But beyond that, the part that I've gotten to know of Dan, which is phenomenal, is he really thinks and breathes and lives water issues, and is really a kindred spirit in the entire industry, moving water issues around. I have not met a person like him otherwise. So with that introduction, let me hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Manu. Thanks very much to the Earth Institute and Columbia Water Center and Professor Sachs and Professor Lal. I'm going to, in an attempt to get us a bit more on time, I'm going to dispense with any long opening remarks, which I always have planned. So I'll do my best to kind of abridge them. But, you know, we heard this at the earlier panel. Gretchen in particular and many of the other panelists kind of amplify the idea of a systems approach and thinking differently and thinking innovatively and looking at the entire water cycle. And I couldn't agree more. I think to mitigate risks and to seize opportunities, that is an absolute necessity. I would pose a question which in some ways is a bit rhetorical, but it's something to start your wheels thinking, perhaps for the course of this panel and even beyond. And that is that common systems framework, particularly in the US, potentially related to respecting, protecting, and fulfilling water as a human right? And it's something that hasn't been explicitly talked about very much in the United States. I think many people kind of assume that everyone in the United States has that right fully protected. And unfortunately, that's not true. So the UN General Assembly, about a year and a half ago, officially recognized water and sanitation as a human right. And the more you think about it, and the more I think about it, it provides really an interesting and holistic framework around which to frame many of the discussions, and specifically safety, sufficiency, acceptability, that is acceptability to stakeholders and varied stakeholders, physical accessibility, and finally affordability. And certainly I hope everyone by this time knows that affordability goes beyond just merely increasing the price of water. It's looking for and hoping to form a strategic, a robust, a comprehensive framework around the value of water. It's not just pricing. It's laws, it's policies, it's regulations, it's consumer education, it's all of the above. So with that rhetorical question posed, we'll have each 5 minutes or so from each of the panelists, as we did in the previous panel, and then we'll have some questions to address to hopefully stimulate some dialogue. So I'd like to start with Brooke Barton. Brooke is a very common face at many of these water gatherings in the past few years, certainly. Brooke leads Ceres Water Program, directing the organization's research in corporate and investor engagement on the risks and opportunities related to growing water scarcity. She's the co-author of the series Aqua Gauge, a framework for 21st century water risk management, which I urge everyone to look at. It's really quite a remarkable tool. Author of the 2010 series study with Bloomberg and UBS, Murky Waters, Corporate Reporting on Water Risk, which I can tell you as a private sector member, that really started the ball rolling in terms of elevating the visibility of corporate water risk to many corporations. And as a researcher for the Harvard Business School Social Enterprise Initiative, she wrote case studies and articles on corporate sustainability. Please welcome Brooke.
And I have to give Dan a lot of credit for a lot of the thinking that we've had at Ceres and a lot of the learning we've had about the human right to water and really what it does mean for corporations today. It's not a tricky principle to implement, as Dan and the folks at PepsiCo know, but it's really critical moving forward. But just to give a little bit more context about the perspective that I bring, it's really good to be here. And we are at Ceres, we're a nonprofit organization, but we are also a network of institutional investors. We work with about 100 U.S. institutional investors that collectively manage around $11 trillion in assets. And we work with them in a lot of different ways, but a lot of this is built on the notion that the investment community is increasingly looking to better understand the financial materiality of different environmental issues and trends, including climate change and, of course, water stress. And on behalf of those investors, we do a lot of research, as was mentioned by Dan, and looking at corporate water risk, but also we are spending an increasing amount of our efforts looking at the water sustainability of the U.S. Municipal water utilities. We are, taking an investment angle there too. As many of you know, the U.S. Water sector is primarily financed by municipal bonds. It's traditionally been seen as a very safe asset class for investors. I think maybe a little bit less so in the past few years, given the financial crisis and some of the stresses we're seeing related to water availability in the country. But it's through this investment angle that we've been really looking at issues like transparency in the water sector. And the fact that there is, to date, really very limited comprehensive comparable data for investors on some of the key operating issues and sustainability risks related to our water systems, anything from these issues of growing variability of water supply due to climate change, the challenges and the kind of levels of effort that are going into demand management in different parts of the country, and even very simple things like leakage. Data on leakage, very hard to get, very hard for investors to begin to use when they're doing their credit analysis. I'll also say that I know this is very hard to believe, but the credit rating agencies are not doing the best job in many cases in looking at some of these sustainability risks in the muni market. So we've been talking with them, and I think we're certainly seeing some progress. But on certain issues that are really important for the sector, demand management, rate setting, the approach they're taking, I would say still is not quite as nuanced as it could be. Now, one of the major risks that we've seen in looking at the U.S. water sector in terms of credit health is really the fact that many, well, I won't say many, but certainly some water systems are still over forecasting demand as they're thinking about their capital investment plans. We know that obviously that the amount of money that goes into securing new supply in many parts of the country is extremely expensive at this point. There really isn't, particularly in the arid West, extra water to be had except through some pretty innovative and costly means. So a lot of systems are still thinking about incurring some fairly intensive capital costs and new debt, debt that will have to be serviced in part through increased rates and through, hopefully, I think that's the assumption, more demand from ratepayers. But that's a bit of a conundrum, I think. And that gets to the one piece of data I just wanted to share as part of the conversation today, which is a chart that Seattle Public Utilities itself has shared with many folks. Many of you might know Paul Fleming from Seattle Public Utilities. They've been quite vocal about some of the lessons they've learned about their own forecasting methods around water demand. So back in 1990, they were projecting significant increases in water demand within the city. A lot of that was premised on an assumption of a direct relationship between population growth and water demand. For a variety of reasons, they made some pretty significant investments in conservation instead of adding a lot of new supply. And so you see there's a number of different wedges that got them down to their 2007 forecast and their new projected track out to 2030. A lot of that was driven by changes in their rates that drove more conservation, other conservation programs they put into place, the wonderful changes we're seeing in many places because plumbing efficiency is really kicking in. But the big takeaway here is that's 100 million gallons a day in difference between what was projected and what they're actually expecting now. That's a lot of money saved. That's a lot of risk taken out of their system. And I think it's something that we all need to do a little bit more thinking on, a lot of water systems, and particularly I think on the investment side, that the assumptions and the projections around demand are often a little bit off the mark. There's a bit of error around them, of course, as there are with all projections. But there are also, of course, a lot of political drivers that are encouraging the local decision makers to think more about supply augmentation than maybe around some of the conservation issues that we know are opportunities that exist. I want to just, before I wrap up, say there are two initiatives that CERI's working on right now that we hope will help to advance some of these challenges, or address some of these challenges, rather. One is a framework for municipal water utility disclosure that we'll be releasing next week. a voluntary framework that we've been working and developing with a number of investors, and that we'll be asking the credit rating agencies and also the National Federation of Municipal Analysts to take up in terms of how they're looking at some of these key sustainability factors in U.S. water systems. We're also doing some new research looking at conservation-based rate structures and which ones actually work both in driving down demand, but just as importantly in keeping utility revenue stable. We can't bankrupt our water systems through rate increases that aren't financially viable, but we do need to find some balance in the middle, and so we're hoping to bring some new research and some new thinking to that, and particularly to the financial community. So thanks so much, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Brooke. You know, as water infrastructure ages, systems fail, and as human infrastructure ages, systems fail. So I'm finding now that I have to hold this about 2 inches from my face to be able to read it, so I apologize for that. But it's my pleasure now to introduce Michael Dean, who's Executive Director of the National Association of Water Companies. Before joining the NAWC, Mr. Dean was the Associate Assistant Administrator for Water in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from 2007 to January 2009. He serves on the PICTE Water Fund Advisory Board, the Xylem Global Water Advisory Board, and the Board of Directors of the National Association for Public-Private Partnerships. Please welcome Michael.
Thank you, Dan. I was a little worried there. I wasn't sure where you were going when you got up to introduce me and started talking about failing human infrastructure. But I'm glad
I treat the panel as well.
So thank you. And thank you, Manu, and Columbia Water Center and Earth Institute for the opportunity to join you today. And thank all of you for being here to have this very robust discussion. I hope it continues for the rest of the afternoon. I came prepared as the association that I represent is water utilities, in this case, they're private water utilities and companies that operate municipal water utilities under contract. So when I took water systems, I came intending to do a very, very literal kind of survey of some of the risks and opportunities that municipal or public purpose water and wastewater systems take. So I have to compliment the first panel. I looked their title is Total Urban Water Cycle, and as we went through that panel, I realized that they touched just about everything I was talking about, which is good in the sense that at least we're looking at managing water utility systems in the broader, starting to as part of the broader urban water cycle. It's still a lot to go there. So with that, I'm just going to briefly go through what is probably now more of a summary of what we've been talking about. Hopefully can help tee up our discussion rather than a survey of things we haven't already heard about here. So rising costs for compliance, and we've heard quite a bit about today. Increasingly, we're able to see new contaminants, to treat new contaminants. We as a society have to determine whether we actually want to remove those contaminants. That's something that we don't talk about enough, I don't think. But I also want to talk about expected service. For utilities, when you kind of look at the costs in there, a lot of that is expected service, particularly in this day and age, I think, of a networked and very impatient sometimes populace and customers. You want access to things online. You don't want to wait around for repairs to come on board. All those things can be done, but they start really adding up cost of service at a time when costs are raising for lots of other reasons as well. So another discussion we need to have is what is the level of service you as a customer are willing to pay for, not just expect. And then also, rising costs, we talk about energy consumption. A lot of technologies are much higher use of energy, and with raising energy costs is something that we're facing and need to balance as well. Declining consumption, thank you, Brooke. I think that's the one thing the first panel didn't get to. I was going to talk about is the impact of declining consumption. But it is real. Even at a time we're talking about stressed water sources, water utilities, most of my member companies are seeing 1 to 3% at least consistent decline in consumption year over year. After a 10-year, 5-year period of time, that kind of compounded rate is significant. And that's a good thing in general, but obviously that's also a huge decline in revenues. And so we need to deal with that. Some of this is in response to price response. A lot of that 1 to 3%, one of my companies in Connecticut looked into it. They determined it was mainly washing machines and as people in their demographic were rebuilding their houses and remodeling houses. Just that alone was leading between 1 and 3% decline in consumption in their service area. So that's happening naturally and is going to continue, despite active conservation programs. customer rates that do not support sustainable infrastructure. So even without that declining revenue, the existing rate structure we've heard about does not cover the full cost of many utility systems. It's not across the board statement, but in particular, if looking at depreciation and replacing of infrastructure. I've had too many discussions in my previous life at EPA with utility managers when we were pushing full cost pricing. You know, we're doing full cost pricing, Michael. We're paying our bills, our operating costs, and we're serving our debt. You know, it kind of asks, is there something missing there in a high capital cost, long-lived utility structure? What about replacing your infrastructure, not paying for the infrastructure you've already put in place? So we really need to focus on that, and I know that's something that Ceres, when you've been looking at some of the impacts and looking at as well. So deterring infrastructure, we've heard a lot about it, I think today. And we know all the grades. You know, I think I was heartened a little bit last week when we went from D- to D and the ASCE thing. I would like to think that's partly reflected in we are starting to see increasing rates well above inflation as well. So I think communities are starting to make the investments that are necessary. The other thing is it's really hard to manage your deteriorating infrastructure if you don't know where it is or what it is. And in this country, I think there's a real dearth of true asset management that gets people to understand not just how old their infrastructure is, but when it should be replaced, what the impacts of not replacing it are, making really informed business decisions. You know, Gretchen, I think you talked about in your opening remarks, we need a real sustainable business model, and that's whether it's a public or private utility, but making decisions based on real business decisions, not just on hope or what happens. And then it's kind of the other part of that, which we've been talking about, is the communicating what the impact is if we don't do anything about that. It's very difficult to say, you know, if we don't, down the road someplace this will happen, and get people to care about it. And I'm going to touch back to this at the end. And then security and reliability of supply, we've heard about it. For those of you, I think this morning I missed part of it, but across sectors, urban, you know, agriculture, mining, urban agriculture, urban and energy in particular. Again, I put it in the context of security and reliability, not necessarily the stress, because sometimes it's pretty good supply, but in a changing world of variability, and securing that is the real challenge that we face. Even in water-rich areas, I think you see it where they're changing demographics, and hopefully when growth starts kicking up again in a lot of places, is ensuring a constant and reliable supply for that. So let's switch to the opportunities here quickly. Manu, I agree with you. You said at the opening that you know, every risk is an opportunity. I have 5 of each. I'm not sure I did that consciously, but it certainly reflects what I strongly believe in as well. Improving operational efficiencies. I think we're getting a lot better, and we've heard quite a bit about it here. But energy costs, labor costs, procurement, particularly in the municipal sector, data management and utilization, we can do a lot more. I mean, I had a president of my association 2 years ago who reminded us we're not as good as we think we are. You know, we think we're pretty good and efficient, but don't rest on your laurels. There's so much that can be squeezed out of every utility in this country, I believe, including some of the best run ones. So we need to do that. And as Gretchen has made a point, I think twice, every dollar in O&M you save can go into this infrastructure that we're concerned about making an investment in. Implementing technological innovations. Obviously heard quite a bit about that earlier too. My previous boss at EPA, Ben Grumbles, many of you may know him, has a saying that I like to repeat as often as possible. There is no such thing as wastewater, only wasted water. You know, there's a lot that we can do just in the wastewater itself of resource mining, energy mining out of that, mineral and other resource recovery, as well as certainly looking at more reuse and combined water management. As I started saying at the beginning, kind of looking at every utility as part of a network of other utilities in the watershed, as well as all the ecological needs of that watershed as well. So I think that it's a lot that we can do there. And then, you know, the reuse of water we've heard about. I agree with everyone's been saying that this is the future. It's not easy. And its potable water use is very difficult. Some of the industrial water use is easier. I was talking to Rod at lunch. You didn't have the time to share your story about Sydney. You have some very interesting things going on there. But again, roll up our sleeves, you know, after we leave the latest conference and go back and actually try to implement these things. And there's a lot going on that we need to get those success stories out there. Increasing public and private sector collaboration. We talk about technological innovation. There's also the need for management innovation and financial innovation. We heard about it from Australia. David, you mentioned it at the beginning as well. Just the need. This is no longer about. It used to be public versus private, unfortunately, and I've been on both sides, representing the private sector now. Now it's not that. Fortunately, it's more public or private, and we got to get beyond that to public and private. What is the solution for any particular community, for its particular needs and political realities? And that needs to be part of it as well. So, but the key is looking at alternative project delivery, alternative management structures, and breaking down the barriers. We spent quite a bit of time with governmental entities, including Congress most recently, of you don't have to promote things. There's so many legacy barriers that were put in place under tax policy or the Clean Water Act or something for very good reasons at that time that are just, they're artifacts that just hinder us from going forward with things that we all know we can and should be doing. And this is all about, again, we've heard it a few times today, but not enough, risk management, how to better manage the risk. And when you break down those barriers and bring the best of the public and private sector, you can really balance that risk and manage it better. And then I'm going to end on my favorite as well, which is educating customers on the value of water. We keep hearing about it, and there are some things underway. It's a wide open opportunity, and it's absolutely necessary if we're going to mitigate the risks and pursue the opportunities that we're talking about this afternoon, to talk to the people and to decision makers about all these issues and in a way that makes sense to them, that they can buy in and engage. Too often it's a matter of, hey, that's interesting, I'm more educated, but what's the call to action? And how do we get them as individuals to be engaged? And it must be in the language. I'm a policy guy. I'm not an engineer, I'm a policy guy, but more and more I'm spending time with communications people and social media and whatnot. We need to speak in a language, and maybe a visual language rather than a verbal language, that impacts people and drives them to challenge. And we keep hearing about we're a slow, stodgy industry, and fortunately we're starting to get out of our little shell. But until we are successful in really, busting out of that cocoon and talking to people, particularly young people. So I'm thrilled to see students in the audience here. Our future, absolutely, and look forward to having a discussion with all of you on all of these very important issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Interesting starting comment where you brought up quality, and then you said we have to decide whether or not we want to remove particular constituents, particularly things like the emerging contaminants. And then you ended on we need educational programs. And the one thing that I've often struggled with is it's almost at a point analytically where we need to think about educating the general consumer, the general public, about the basics of toxicology. Because the more and more analytical chemistry continues to improve, you're able to detect parts per quadrillion of certain contaminants in water. And the expectation of either none detected or extremely low levels of detectability just really aren't viable anymore. And how we manage to teach a very engaged and increasingly engaged public what that toxicology means, and that if something's there at 1 part per quadrillion, it may not necessarily be bad, I think is going to be an increasing challenge, certainly for multiple stakeholders going forward. The next speaker is Jonathan Caledon. Jonathan, I've seen him many years now in the halls of SEWE during World Water Week. He currently leads 11th Avenue Strategies. He's also the founder of that organization, a consultancy specializing in water, environmental, and conservation issues. He acts as the U.S. representative for the Stockholm International Water Institute and as the coordinator of the Growing Blue Collaborative. His career spans close to 30 years and has involved work in the private, government, and nonprofit sectors. Specific areas of expertise include water, marine, land conservation, planning, due diligence, and corporate governance work, and just about everything in between. Please welcome Jonathan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan Caledon, and listen, I thought I'd divide my 5 minutes into 3 sections. I was trying to do in my head how many seconds I get per section, but didn't get to it. But let me first quote 2 statements by Gretchen when she was sitting up here on the panel. We need to come together into one voice, and we need to join arms with others. The water field, those of us who've worked in it for years, it's remarkably fractured, okay? And it's been relatively ineffective, if I may say so, dating back from decades ago working in it, in terms of coming together to really focus on and articulate the importance of water and all the aspects of it. As you heard, I am coordinating the Growing Blue collaborative. It's about 18 months old. I want to spend some of my seconds talking to you briefly about it. The Columbia Water Center, Manu and Cardinal Entrix, Todd Williams, who's dropped in on his way traveling around the country, Violia's Laurent, Auguste, Gretchen from Xylem. There's a whole group now. It's a private-public collaborative working. It's a data center for water and economics issues, okay? And the goal is to create something that's enduring in the years to come that helps decision makers make decisions about water and to educate the public in general, those who are interested in issues on water. It's a website, it's got associated media with it, and we're building the library slowly but surely. Ceres has just agreed to join it. The World Resources Institute's involved in it. We've got some very important IBM, General Electric, or both, and we've got some very important public and private sector entities who, as Gretchen put it, have joined arms with each other to really advance water issues. We hope globally, really. One of the issues I keep telling some of the more impatient members of Growing Blue is that, we can't run before we walk. If we're thinking of it as a long-term effort, we've got to build it carefully and slowly. When I was at the World Water Forum last year, I met a whole slew of academics from Belgium to the Netherlands, and both of those countries are doing very interesting work on water, who are dying to get involved with Growing Blue. It's just we're not really reaching all that far outside of the U.S. now. But so data is critical for water. Don't think that for a second it isn't. We've heard a bit about it. What I find so fascinating about the water field is that we can go deep, no pun intended, in terms of virtually any issue that we want to get into. And data is truly, truly critical, and we hope through Growing Blue to build a data center that helps decision makers, as I say. Last week, I was at Water Week Latin America. I spent the whole week down in Chile, one of the very few U.S. representatives there. I don't use the term American because they're Americans too. And what I saw and what I see in many parts of the world as I do my work, it makes me wistful to a certain extent and makes me excited and pumped up on, to the other hand, sort of conflicting emotions. New York City will be very glad to hear that I was making, in my presentations, I was talking about how great New York City's water supply system is, and talking about the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is a multi-state cooperative agreement that manages the Delaware River and does a pretty good job of it, through the decades. But what makes me wistful about it is that, at least at the political level, and Manu touched upon this, we seem to be stuck at the federal level at least, okay? The Clean Water Act was up for reauthorization in 1994, close to 20 years ago, and we haven't gotten anywhere with it, okay? So we've really got to, this crowd and others who are recognize the importance of water, we really need to do something about this, okay? We've got to make our leaders at all levels understand the importance of water. Our country's situation is really a remarkable one. You can't pick up our major newspapers without seeing something extraordinary when it comes to water. Jeff Sachs's picture this morning from Indiana, the withered crops. Well, who saw yesterday's New York Times? There was a picture of the Pecos River in New Mexico. The riverbed is absolutely dry, and there are cattle sitting in the middle of it. Okay, we're seeing this stuff week after week, month after here in the U.S., okay? It really is, and I don't like to use the word crisis as far as water goes. I mean, here in the U.S., we can go anywhere from the largest city to the smallest community, still use the water systems without thinking about it. We don't have a crisis compared to some of what I saw last week, for example, okay, where there's, severe access to water. But nevertheless, we've got some serious issues on our hands. We're seeing extraordinary things in the Mississippi River. The Mississippi, 1 year, the Army Corps of Engineers is blowing up levees, so as to flood parts of the Midwest and not other parts. This year, they're blowing up rock formations in the Mississippi because it's so dry, so that it can be used to get the boats and get the billions of dollars of commerce that rely on the Mississippi as a transportation highway, essentially, up and down it. So we're really seeing very, very interesting things and incredibly complex things. Let me finish my 5 minutes with these pictures right here. Okay, these are courtesy of Cardinal Entrix, Todd and his colleagues. Thank you. And this, to me, again, I put these up because I wanted you to come away with some knowledge as to the complexity of some of the issues that we're facing, okay? I do some talking about ecosystem services, okay? And here, I put these up. Here on the left, we've got the drainage area of the Mississippi, about 40% of the country. And it provides enormous ecosystem services benefits to upstream and the Midwest, okay? Almost any conceivable use, we heard from someone earlier today that the Mississippi goes in and out of 7 times on its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. But so whether it's crops, whether it's transportation, as I just mentioned, whether it's city recreational use or rural recreational use, this watershed basin, this river basin, presents a remarkable ecosystem benefit. But then look what happens when we get down to the Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi ends, okay? What's happened down in the Gulf of Mexico is an entirely different story. The ecosystem down there is being destroyed, okay? And it's been destroyed through the decades. Some of it's wetlands, destruction associated with economic activity down there, but some of it, much of it, is due to what's coming out of the Mississippi, okay? Those of us who were around this morning heard about nutrients and nitrogen and phosphate washing down. The Mississippi now has dead zones in it, what are called anoxic zones, where there's no oxygen. This is hurting the fisheries, okay? It affects the water supply systems down there. And again, it's affecting the wetlands as well, so that what we get is we get this clash, as I say. Whose ecosystem services are more important, the upper Mississippi or the lower Mississippi? This just, again, is I'm presenting it to you to shed some light on how complex these situations might be and how data is critical, truly critical in analyzing these systems and coming up with good policy to implement. Thanks. I think I'll stop there and turn the podium back to Dan.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. So our final panelist is Scott Rickards, President, CEO, and co-founder of Waterfund LLC, and he's been based in both the Middle East and Latin America as a hedge fund investor and developer of financial products. He was most recently Senior Business Development Executive at the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, an agency of the Dubai government responsible for Dubai Commodity Asset Management, a hedge fund and ETF investment platform licensed by the Central Bank of the UAE. Please welcome Scott.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Manu, for inviting me to this. It's my first time back at Columbia in 10 years since I graduated, so I have to admit water is probably the last thing I expected to be talking about 10 years ago, but here I am. I'm principally focused today on the subject of financial innovation and water. I think it's, not being a water expert, I'm probably the only non-expert on the panels today. But I do think, from an outsider's perspective, one of the biggest problems in the sector today is clearly access to finance and new forms of financial products that can bring private capital into the water industry. Rod Naylor had said, and I think in his closing remarks, we have the technology, we need the will. And I interpret that as meaning we have the technology, we need the financing. In another remark, I think on the previous panel, New York City has $28 billion of infrastructure needs over the next 20 years. And then separately, we know that the stimulus of $850 billion, less than 1% of that went to water infrastructure. So we've got a huge capital need. We don't have many public sources apart from the ones we already have. And water funding shouldn't be a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be simply a fight over public dollars. We have private markets. We have the most liquid financial markets in the world. And how do we access that capital? How do we bring the Morgan Stanleys and Goldman Sachs of the world into water in a much bigger way than they currently are? Today, municipal debt is basically the single source of finance for water infrastructure in the U.S. So what my company's done is look at water in a slightly different way, and we focused on creating a financial benchmark which could be used for a whole variety of products that can draw capital into the water sector. Initially, we thought this might be something like a price index. In most most tradable commodities, price is the primary concern. There are very few cost indices off of which financial products are based. But water is a bit of a backwards business. It's often sold for far less than it costs to produce. So in the context of water, if you're looking at developing a financial product, it makes sense to focus on the cost. So my firm teamed up with IBM. We announced a few months ago that we're going to publish a water cost index for at least 25% of the world's GDP, which is approximately the 100 largest cities in the world. Now this goes to the point that water is a local resource. Each water agency has a unique cost structure. So what good is a global benchmark for water? Well, first of all, investors like transparency. Transparency is always a good thing. Water is one of the least transparent sectors, and in comparison to energy, for example, there's just very little good financial data out there. Brooke has probably looked at more water financial statements than anyone in the room, and she knows as well as anybody that no two water companies really report alike. Now in the US it's a bit different, but around the world financial data on water is extremely hard to come by. So I think what we're doing in focusing on the cost of water globally is principally to establish the real cost of producing a cubic meter of fresh water. Why is this interesting? Why is this important? Because once you have those benchmarks and once they're streamlined and calculated in an independent and credible way, we can build all kinds of things. One of those are insurance contracts. Another is potentially derivative products on water. And I think water is water companies are conservative by nature. Possibly it's the most conservative big industry we have. So I think insurance is the most logical place to start in terms of offering a first step in financial innovation in water. So for that reason, IBM and Water Fund have focused most of our efforts on establishing a benchmark which could be used for a lot of the big reinsurers and insurance companies out there. And how it would work, I've got one example up there on the slide, but just take take any large desalination project. There was just one in Carlsbad, California. It was a $950 million capital need. It took a lot longer than I think everyone expected for that project to get off the ground. The reason was that there was an equity component of $150 million, which was very difficult to raise. Debt is generally much easier to raise. When you're asking private investors to risk equity capital, it's a much harder ask. And so I think attracting that type of investment to water is extremely important. One way to do that is to help private investors achieve a satisfactory return on investment. One way to do that is to underwrite or insure the notional value of the investment they're making in the water company. So this is one way you could use a financial index in water to achieve greater flows of private capital to the sector. There are many other potential products and variations of this, but I think as a starting point, there's no silver bullet in terms of how to better finance water, but there certainly needs to be more innovation and more thinking about this subject because it's very important. I think there was a lot of talk earlier about all the great water technology. Why don't we access that? Why isn't more of that being used by the big water companies of the world? Well, the answer is it's expensive. And in a world where governments have relatively less capital to allocate to just about everything, including water, we have to come up with more creative solutions. So I put forth this particular idea of an index, a transparent financial cost index is one way to achieve that. But as I say, it's one idea of potentially many that can make a big difference in growing the industry, because I think everybody in the room has an interest in seeing that happen. And again, there's no silver bullet, but I think we need to think more creatively about the subject. And thank you again. Thank you, Manu.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everyone on the panel. I think we have time for a couple of questions. One of them I'd like to start off with is really based on the title of the panel, which is Water Risk. The World Economic Forum, in its Global Risk Index just this year, identified water as among the top 5 most impactful risks for business over the next 5 to 10 years. There have been some difficulties or some, I would say, lack of uniformity in terms of how to quantitate that risk. So the question is, do you think that this risk related to water is really a collection of problems in a few regions, i.e. water-scarce regions, or do you think there's a more systemic problem underlying this? Do we even understand what the risk is and how to quantitate it? And Brooke, you've done a lot of work, I think, with trying to quantify water risk. If you can start, that'd be great.
The basic way that we've tried to parse out and think about water risk at Ceres is by thinking about it in a number of categories. Primarily, we've approached this from the perspective of large corporations and what does water risk mean for them. We talk about physical risk, which is around the question of too much, too little, too bad. Is the water good? Is it sufficient? Are there flooding risks or extreme precipitation risks that could in some way influence an operation or a supply chain, or even your ability to have your customers use your product? Regulatory risks, which I think are relatively, don't need defining. Reputational risks, the perception of how you as a company are using water. And then certainly litigation risks in certain markets, such as the US, around water are important as well. And we've also seen at the same time a proliferation of really innovative methods to quantify risk on a geospatial basis, different maps like the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct, the work that's been done by Veolia and their Water Footprint Index, the work that's been done by WWF and their Water Risk Filter, all of which are in some way or another trying to create indices that overlay some of these different aspects of water risk and come up with, in some cases, a single number that could allow you to compare across a bunch of different places and regions. Now, I think the reality is that water risk for me, if I'm running a bottling plant, is different than the water risks for you if you're running a mining plant, even if we're in the same place. And in fact, if I'm the bottling plant, the mining operation actually might be my biggest risk. So there's complexity to thinking about this, but I think there's actually a lot of really exciting tools and smart people working on it, and we're in a much better position to begin to quantify than we were, say, 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you, Brooke. So, we're going to show just how adaptable we are as a panel and as a moderator and as an audience, because we have the good fortune of having Professor Jeff Sachs here to provide some closing comments. And both panels, I think, have gone woefully over time. So we want to respect Professor Sachs's time. So let's just thank the panel here, and we'll absolve you from further questions until the reception. And I'd like to introduce Professor Sachs for some reactions to what he's heard so far.
Let me thank both panels, first of all, which have been absolutely outstanding. We have a rule which is to finish on time, so we will finish at 4 p.m. sharp, and I will turn the mic over to Manu in just a moment. I think it's clear things are getting complicated, a lot more complicated than they have been in the past. And if you can imagine, this is a rich country with more human capital per square foot than any other place on the planet. And it is plentifully abundant in resources, and its population density is one of the lowest in the world of a temperate zone environment, certainly. And yet, look how complicated this is. So imagine what's happening all over the world right now. This discussion we've just had should be taking place in all 193 member governments of the UN. Some are going under the sea as the sea level rises. Some are battling increasing desertification as precipitation declines and temperatures rise. Some have a population density, especially the countries in Asia, that are more than 10 times the US population density and are depending on rapidly depleting groundwater. I just did another trip around the world, which I do every few weeks actually, and the moment you step into Asia, you're in a different world, of course, because of density and the dynamics that are so different from what we're seeing, and yet look at how hard it is for the US. So what's happening? Well, obviously, we treated many of our natural resources and ecosystem services as essentially free throughout most of human development, and now we're hitting the boundaries, and we're hitting them very fast and very hard, and we don't have proper pricing, proper design, proper systems to manage this. And we didn't have to when the marginal costs were very low, and now the marginal costs are not only high, but steep. And we certainly don't have a political system that is at all attuned to this. So we're having to invent on the fly. And if you noticed in Washington, it's not exactly a group of savants in Congress that are in a sophisticated way addressing these issues. Any mayor is a lot more sophisticated than almost any member of Congress, I have to say, on these issues, because they have to make sure that there's water day by day, and the Congress is completely an ideological and vested interest outer space compared to these issues. So we really have a major problem. I like the fact that the word system has come up countless times. Again, we didn't think of these things as systems when we didn't have to make the interconnections. We didn't actually care as much what happened to the outflow as to the inflow when we were just abstracting what seemed like endlessly available water. By the way, everything about water is true with energy, which may be even more complicated in some ways, although I think probably comparable in complexity. We have a profound energy crisis. Hydrofracking ain't solving it, believe me, ladies and gentlemen. It's just the latest hype and buzz compared to the real complexities of the energy system. But I would say the systems problems are ubiquitous now. Healthcare, the same thing. We built up a health system based on the idea of the family doc in what is actually a systemic industry, but we have no system. We have a monstrosity of a non-system right now that has to be systematized. It would be like having an internet with everybody with their own IP formula and metrics, and that's literally what we have. We can't even have doctors talk to each other still. We can't even get electronic medical records in this country. So the systems building is absolutely essential. We're also realizing, even though our public rhetoric is not there yet, that all these systems are public and private. And so everything is at the interface of the public and private sector. That's very tough for us to handle when we're in this ideological mold that nothing should be with government, everything should be with government, when everything we're talking about is a complex interface of public and private. And that's true of the financing, it's true of the regulatory, it's true of the design features. Very complicated issues. We didn't have a chance in this brief discussion to talk very much about the relative role of governments at different levels, which I think is one of the most important challenges of our federal system and our existential circumstances. Are these issues addressable, or at what level are these issues addressable? Almost surely municipalities are too small for almost anything we're talking about. States are artificial boundaries in watersheds. Regional solutions do make sense for many things, but we don't have regional government in the United States, though we have some compacts and we have some regional, almost voluntary associations. And presumably the federal government has to play a role. But sorting out federal, regional, state, local is a daunting task even when you're focused on it. But I don't get a sense that, and I really stand to be corrected, I don't get a sense that there's serious focus on this at all right now. I've been a critic and kind of aghast at several of our recent administrations. It's completely nonpartisan aghastness. But the inability to have systematic planning, to the idea of planning, by the way, which I'm a big fan of. I like markets. Let me just say that I still am, if they haven't kicked me out, a card-carrying economist. But we need plans. I don't see plans. The word is a dirty word, even. But how are you going to manage a water system without plans? How are you going to finance a water system without plans? And it strikes me that the federal government seems incompetent these days at making plans. I haven't seen one coherent plan come out of this administration. And I voted for this administration twice, just to be clear. But I don't find it coherent at all on any of these issues. You don't make a water system out of shovel-ready projects. You don't make a water system out of a stimulus package. This is absurd. We need 20-year frameworks. And yet this seems to be almost an allergy and a point of incompetence for our politicians right now, that they don't understand that that's really how the world needs to work. And businesses need to tell them, hey, planning isn't against markets. Businesses make 20-year plans. They have to. They're making 50-year investments, for God's sake. You better have an idea of what the hydrology is going to be, what the demographics are going to be, what demand is going to be in the future if you're building infrastructure. And yet what do? We have a 2-year spending boom on infrastructure. Are you kidding? What's that supposed to do? We're going to build our fast rail in 2 years? We're going to correct our water crisis in a 2-year spending boom because it's shovel ready? And my profession has lost complete sight of this also. I have found the whole Keynesian rhetoric absurd because Krugman and others, I think, are just wildly off because government isn't about pumping up pressure. It's about actually spending on something valuable. And that's not the same thing as pumping up pressure in a tire. And so aggregate demand is the least of our issues. Actually planning what we spend on is a vastly more interesting thing if we're going to have a decent country in 10 or 20 or 30 years. And yet we don't do that right now. And the macroeconomics profession is completely useless in this. Actually, I can tell you why at length. I don't have it at length right now. But the reason is because economists are not trained to know anything about a water system, infrastructure, any physical realities. They're trained to know about GNP the next quarter. And the financial markets, unfortunately, are even less trained. And so the comments about the financial markets, this is a disaster. And Wall Street really has been a walking disaster on this. So we really have to get back to some serious plans and the ability to look 20 or 25 years ahead in this country before we wreck everything. And it's coming fast, these problems. So I'm intent on doing whatever part I can play, both at the Earth Institute and in my other hat as basically senior advisor to the United Nations system on sustainable development and senior advisor to the Secretary General on these issues. He's asked me recently to form a global network of business and academic expertise on sustainable development. So we call it the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It's a global effort because I travel to 50 or 60 countries a year. Everybody's got this right now. Nobody knows what to do. I think in a way the U.S. it's got much greater talent and much greater market facility, but it's actually got much worse mechanisms for thinking ahead than many of our counterparts in Northern Europe, for example, where they actually think about the future still, which is a little bit interesting. And I wish we had a planning commission in the U.S. or a planning ministry. We actually need it, but you know we're so far ideologically committed to not thinking ahead. Actually, Larry Summers, when he was senior advisor to Obama, said to me, and I quote, "We do not plan in America, Jeffrey," when I was complaining to him about the lack of an energy plan. And he was telling the truth, but he was proud of it, not feeling ashamed by it. But that is the truth. They don't plan. They count votes. They plan for the next election. That they're very good at. Down to the precinct, down to the voter, down to the last focus group. But think about a problem that's 20 years ahead, forget it. It's not happening right now. So the Secretary General asked me to try to work with industry and academic leadership around the world to address the big challenges on sustainable development. And I put those as energy, especially decarbonizing the energy system. I don't know of a tougher issue given the vested interests and the depth of fossil fuel-based energy in every DNA of every energy system in the world. But I can tell you the climate risks are so big that if we don't get this done in the next 40 years, we're really going to leave a legacy which is a disgrace and a wreckage for the second half of the century. And just having a new granddaughter right now, I really hate that idea. I really hate that idea. But that's the path we're on. So energy is one. Sustainable cities, which is what we're talking about to an important extent, is a second one. We're working with city governments around the world, and we want to work with you, leading companies and leading analysts of this, to actually get this right. And I'm being deluged, to use a water metaphor, with requests from around the world for help on this, especially in places where the urban populations are rising 5% a year in many of the developing countries. And you know what that means. That's a 14-year doubling time. And that's what we're facing in a lot of the world right now. And infrastructure is 1950, while the population is doubling every 14 years. So sustainable cities is a second major category. Sustainable agriculture, which intersects with a lot of what we talked about, is a third huge category, also incredibly complex because there are essentially as many farm systems as there are farmers. Farming is so localized, so specific to the ecology, the soils, the topography, that there is no uniform answer on these issues. But we know that agriculture is going to be dramatically harmed by the climate change ahead, by the groundwater depletion, by other stresses, by the loss of biodiversity. And at the same time, it's actually still the #1 driver of anthropogenic change, just as the map showed, of all of that nitrogen and phosphorus moving down the Mississippi into this massive dead zone. There are 130 estuaries around the world that have that same picture right now. And those estuaries are among the most important and richest of ecosystems in the world because they are the unique, that the meeting of the fresh and salt water is one of the absolute unique treasures of global ecosystem services, especially if you like oysters and clams and other shellfish and a lot of the protein that we depend on. I kind of favor that. And we're wrecking the estuaries around the world right now with this overloading of nutrient fluxes, not to mention antibiotics, not to mention pesticides and other poisons, because we're trying to also feed 7.2 billion people in the world, and that's going to be 8 billion by 2024, 9 billion by 2044, and 10 billion by 2084, according to the medium forecast of the UN. So all of this is to say that I really appreciate this discussion this morning and this afternoon. I'm very grateful for the industry leaders that are here. I want us to join forces in a really serious way. I'm going to be fielding a number of task forces to cover the U.S. as part of this global UN effort. I find it a little bit absurd to do this, but when you see the kids in the White House, and they are kids that are running around the White House, you realize it's actually not going to get done by the White House, not going to get done by the Congress. If you've participated in congressional hearings recently, I just had to walk out of the most recent one I was in on energy to call my wife and tell her it was far worse than I thought what's happening to this country. Then I went back in, tried to hold my nose and my breath as this ended. And for some strange reason, it's actually going to have to be academia and business to take the lead right now, because governments, politicians will not lead. There was actually a fascinating sentence in President Obama's speech in Jerusalem last week, which I found kind of horrifying. But he said, don't expect politicians to lead. You have to press the don't expect politicians in a democracy to lead. You're going to have to do that, he told the young people. Well, at least it was honest. I mean, I grew up in a belief in politicians leading, actually, and still believe in that model of solving problems. I wish they would solve problems, but they don't anymore, because they're too well advised by their political advisors, which is take no risks. We have focus group this. Don't say anything. Don't do anything, and you will get by. And that's our political culture now. So we won't get by, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, given the boundaries that we're hitting. We're going to have to change direction. We need new ways to do this. We need the most important companies to come forward, work together with the scientists, with the academics, to properly get this done. And that's why I'm especially grateful to your being here, and why I'm going to call on you soon so that we can follow up in practical ways. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jeff. This reminds me of a quote, Winnie the Pooh. I'm just a bear of a very small brain. I feel like that, like, why did I schedule myself to say anything after Jeff? It's completely pointless. So I think the other thing I'm going to mention to you is there's a country called Bhutan, which has led to the happiness index. And one of the things the king, who was then 24 years old, started out with was when he was asked to explain what is happiness and how do you discriminate between the Western world and what you're considering happy. One of the things he said was that in schools in the Western world, they make the little kids sit down and an adult yells at them for 8 hours. In Bhutan, we won't do that. You know, we'll have everybody sit in a circle and talk. We've had you guys sitting in a circle, but we've had people yelling at you the whole time. So I think what I'll do at this point is recognize that perhaps we have built a bit of amity in terms of moving together on a collaborative effort, and mention the fact that the university here and other universities are about students who are going to be our future leaders, and possibly this is a point of engagement for that group, and that's what we are offering you with us. And I'll liberate you to go and imbibe things there and talk around, because maybe we'll do better with that than my yelling at you any further. Thank you.